Hello everyone and welcome back to the next video in the vocal analysis series. This is admittedly a little bit overdue. I had made a couple of posts kind of detailing why. The main reason being that I'm always a little creatively drained in the winter and February has been extremely cold. So you might think that being stuck inside would give someone more time to work on creative projects, but that's usually not how it works. So between that and a couple of urgent, unexpected work projects, I just did not have the time or the energy to work on these videos for the past couple of weeks. And living in Canada, I'm not at all unused to fake spring. I know this is fake spring, I know it's going to get colder again, but hopefully not minus 30 cold, so I hope to keep a more regular schedule on these in the future, but you never know. We'll see what happens. That being said, we are going to talk about Subaru today, and Subaru is interesting because, unlike a lot of the other characters where I kind of went into their videos knowing mostly what the general storyline of the discussion would be, Subaru doesn't really fit any of those patterns. Because up until this point, a lot of these videos have been about either the voice actors kind of growing alongside their characters, or the voice actors already being fairly established singers, and either having to change their voices as their characters progressed, or being essentially told to pull back at the beginning and kind of slowly being allowed to open up and show more of what they were always capable of doing. And Subaru kind of doesn't fit any of that. Obviously, Kaki is a very good singer and was a very good singer at the time that Ensemble Stars began. He has an extensive discography both of character singing and of his own projects that he's done. But unlike some of the other characters, it never seemed like they were pulling Subaru back or trying to make it seem like the character was not as good of a singer as the voice actor was. So in terms of technical progression, there probably isn't a whole lot. He was really good at the beginning, he's still really good. That's kind of never changed. So I had to think a lot about what I was actually going to talk about in this video while I was recording the music, and I think the biggest thing is just how he adapts vocally to different styles of music and just talking about his voice in general. And that's probably where this is going to go. So once again, I'm going to say that this might be a shorter video because there's less of a progression that's going to happen, but I've said that before and it hasn't been true, so we'll see where it goes. In terms of a vocal comparison, like I said, there is a lot that I could pull from. And there are probably going to be people saying, well, why didn't you pick this character or that character because he has so many, but in the end, I went with 3 that I am the most familiar with and that I think all showcase different aspects of Kaki's singing voice, so. Like I said, these are just 3 of his characters that I'm very familiar with. Azuma from A3, obviously a very different character from Subaru, both in terms of what his voice sounds like and personality-wise. The second one, obviously, you knew if there was a sword boy involved, I had to talk about it. I will admit, I didn't remember his singing voice for Guisamaru being quite so deep, because his speaking voice is kind of more on, like, the Azuma tone level, but that gave me more justification to put it in here, so I'm happy about that. And the last one was, I still think of him as Kumarin, that's not his name. His name is Rintaro from Dreaming, which I feel like anyone that played it still thinks of it fondly. It deserved so much better than it was treated by the companies that put it out. And I still have a soft spot for a lot of the characters, so if I get the chance to include any of them in this series, I probably will. Kumarin was one of my favorite characters, probably the most similar to Subaru vocally, but I still wanted to put him in here for those reasons, so there you go. So I kind of alluded to it before, but Kaki technically is a very strong singer. His natural tone veers a bit into the nasal category, but it's the kind of nasalized tone that I really like, in that it sounds very warm, and it sounds very warm regardless of where in his tone he's singing. And we'll get into more of the technicalities as we go along, but that's kind of my general overview of his voice. Like I said, I've always liked his voice, so even though sometimes I feel like I personally kind of overlook Subaru as a character, I've always appreciated his singing voice. And I do feel like Subaru is one of those characters. Obviously, in most of these idle games, you have, like, the Genki protagonist, face of the game, and that is kind of the role that Subaru fills. And I feel like when the game was being developed, they had kind of already decided what his role would be. And as a result, I feel like his character hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. Obviously, he's gotten moments where you learn about everything with his past and his father and things that are more serious and that add depth to his character. But I feel like the core and the essence of his character has remained very consistent, which isn't the case with everyone from Ensemble Stars, but for Subaru specifically, I feel like that might be another one of the reasons why it seems like his voice hasn't changed that much, because unlike a couple of the other characters we've talked about in the past with Rei and Yuta, where their characters either have changed as the series has gone on, or we've learned, about a past version of them that was quite a bit different from their current selves in the storyline. Subaru's never really had that, so I feel like that all kind of contributes to the fact that his voice at the beginning and his voice now are very similar in a lot of ways. In terms of Trickstar, however, they are the one unit that I would say has changed the most vocally since the beginning. And I don't know how much of a deep cut this is now, especially for people that might have gotten into the series a little bit later, but out of the voice actor changes that have happened throughout the lifetime of Ensemble Stars, Hokuto's was probably the one that affected the group makeup the most. Obviously, Mitsuru's was the most recent, and in Mitsuru's case, they tried very, very hard to make his current voice actor sound as close as they could to his old voice actor. And in Arashi's case, it didn't matter because her first voice actor left before they had actually recorded any music for the game. But Hokei's original voice actor was there for the first 2 albums, so that was, I believe, at least 4 songs that they did with that specific makeup. And again, not sure how common knowledge this is anymore because it happened in 2017, but Hokei used to be voiced by Hoseon, who is obviously a very well-known voice actor in his own right, and it wasn't anyone's fault that he had to stop voicing Hokuto. It was a medical issue, I believe something with his throat or his vocal cords that required surgery, and the timeline for Ensemble Stars just didn't allow for him to take enough time off to come back to it after that with their recording schedule. And I did love his voice for Hokuto a lot, but we'll talk about that more in the relevant video. Right now, the biggest thing in terms of group makeup is that Hoseon's voice for Hokuto was a lot higher tonally and had more of this kind of this huskiness, this rasp to it that Mino doesn't. And Mino's voice is a lot lower in general. So for the first few songs, I would say Trickstar in general just sounds higher because Mao was kind of carrying the low part all by himself. And now Mao and Hokuto kind of share that bass line, and Makoto and Subaru can come in on top of them. So if you do get a chance to listen to the original versions of the Trickstar songs, which are still out there somewhere, I'm not going to play any of them in this video because, again, that'll be for the Hokuto video. But there is quite a difference, even within the unison singing, of how the mixing sounds with the group. So it's very interesting because, unlike with Mitsuru, they made no attempt at all to have Hokuto's voice actors sound anything like each other. Probably for the best, considering how much singing has gone on since then. But still interesting to look at that Trickstar is really the only group that this has happened to on this level. And when we actually get into the songs, you'll notice that for the first 2 albums, Subaru and Hokuto never really sang together, and now they sing together almost all the time, and I am inclined to believe that it is because originally their voices were much more similar than they are now, and as we've discussed in the series a few times already, at the beginning, the producers were not very brave when it came to putting voices together. But I think that's all I wanted to say for an intro. I don't know how long this is going to end up, probably too long again, but we'll get into the songs now. And the other thing I also noticed was that Subaru sings a lot less than I thought he would, considering he is Mr. Ensemble Stars himself. But compared to someone like Rei, he really doesn't have that many songs, and I've even put in, I threw in the original version of Only Your Stars because there is an old version that's just Subaru and Makoto, but then I think when music came out, they did one with all 4 of them, so that's the one I used just, again, to get more voices. And I threw in one of the anime openings that has a Trickstar version of it, so even though I'm trying to add songs, it still doesn't add up to the amount that Rei has, but we'll take what we can get. There's more than enough to look at, so let's get into it. 同じ歌奏でるみたいに集まったんだね君と出会えたこときっと叶った感情を求められない太いけど一緒に来てよ I wanna be only your star 叶った感情のままに歌う And this version of it, like I said, is also nice because he does get to sing with all of them, so you get to kind of hear what he sounds like as a bass line with all 3 of the other members of Trickstar. And in the Tsukasa video, I talked about how I feel like I'm not necessarily qualified to speak about when a voice actor is actually lowering their larynx to sing for certain character voices, or lowering or raising, as the case may be. For Subaru, I feel like he's always singing with a very high larynx. And the reason I say that is because even when he sings low, like you can hear in this song, there is a distinct difference as to how his voice sounds when he's singing low for Subaru, as opposed to when he's singing low for like Azumar or Guisumaru, like we listened to in the examples. So that would lead me to believe that it is actually a technical difference that's happening, and that's probably what it is. But in terms of how his voice blends with the other members of Trickstar, Hokei and Mao, at least now, both have very low voices, so he sounds fine with them. Makoto probably has a more similar voice in terms of that Makoto also has a very nasalized tone, but it's a much different sort of nasalized tone than the one that Subaru has. So there is enough distinction there between them that I think they sound fine together, and they sing a lot together. Typically, Subaru kind of sings evenly, I would say, with everyone from Trickstar, which makes sense. His voice, as we've talked about with other characters that kind of have that warm, nasalized tone, is very easy to blend with. And even when we get into the shuffle units and the other songs, Subaru doesn't sing with that many people, which I find strange, but I don't think I'm ever going to understand how the Ensemble Stars producers decide things, because it feels like his voice would pretty much go with anyone's, but we'll talk about that more as we go on. So we get into Rebellion Star, which I think is still probably the song that is most associated with Trickstar. It was kind of the first big one. It was the first one that got a music video made for it, back when the fandom actually all came together and decided that Trickstar deserved the first music video. And I think that even though Trickstar has been branching out a little more recently in terms of musical genre, I think pop rock is still kind of their niche. That's where they sound the best. It's well suited for all of their voices, so I feel like that's something that they're always going to fall back on, and that's kind of where they started. And this is a really good example of that. I would say, if anything, listening to this now, that Kaki was using more of a breathier tone when he was singing for Subaru in these early songs, which is really interesting because it almost has the effect of sounding less polished, even though technically everything is still where it should be. Kind of adding this little bit of a breath, a little bit of a hesitation to it makes it sound like he's less sure of himself. And I think obviously that makes sense considering how Trickstar started and everything around the main story. So it's really interesting listening to it that you can kind of create these character effects without really sacrificing any of the vocal techniques that go along with it.
Everybody stand up, please.
He also wasn't using nearly as much vibrato as he will eventually use. And Kaki's another one of those singers that has a very strong natural vibrato, sounds really good when he brings it out. In these early songs, again, he was kind of using that really quick vibrato, or else he just wasn't using it at all when he was holding these notes as Subaru. So he's still getting up to notes that would probably be sort of in belting territory, but he's not sustaining them in the way that he would later on in the series. So I guess I kind of take back what I said at the beginning when I said his voice hasn't changed much, because there are these little things happening that it's not nearly as obvious with some of the other characters where the voice actors are quite literally holding themselves back to not sing as well as they actually can. But he's changing his voice in different ways to give the illusion that Subaru isn't as good a singer as Kaki is. And I think it's really interesting listening to it now. So now he's starting to get a little more into that vibrato that you'll hear a lot of, that whenever he has a sustained note, he kind of hits the vibrato more often than not. And again, it's very natural, it's very textbook in a lot of ways, especially when we get into some of the slower songs. There's still a little bit of that breathiness when he's pulling back from certain notes, and like I said at the beginning, he's singing with Mao and Makoto quite a bit in these ones. He doesn't really ever sing with Hokuto, and again, I am quite sure that is because their voices were much more similar the first time they recorded these songs. Trickstar is another one of those groups that's mixed in stereo, so I always have to remember to put both headphones in because otherwise I'm only going to hear one half of the duets. I would say Nijiro no Seasons is the first time he's kind of using his full voice. There is a lot of vibrato, there's a lot of really nice sustained notes. He does the crescendo on one of the long notes that we talked about before, which happens here.
思い出の中に
And I actually like a lot of Trickstar's slower, more ballady songs because I think it gives them a chance to show off more vocally. And generally the voice actors take advantage of that. In terms of head voice, Subaru does go into it sometimes, but he is another one of those characters where his chest voice and his head voice are very similar tonally, so it just really has to do with how high he's singing. That's really the only way to distinguish it. And this is something I've noticed with Kaki's falsetto as well. He has a very smooth transition over his vocal break. So even in these songs where you can hear he's going into belting in some of the higher notes, it sounds very natural when he goes into it. He doesn't really use any sort of vocal tricks to get him there easier. It's just a really clean transition, which again is very hard to do, speaks to his technical prowess as a singer. But yeah, I always appreciate the slower Trickstar songs, and we'll get into some more of them, but they're the ones that really show off the technicality of his vocals. So this is the first album that was recorded only with this version of Trickstar, at least as far as we know. And you can see that right away, Subaru and Hokuto are finally starting to sing together, which is something that really hasn't happened up until now. And more than that, especially just listening to their duet part in here, Hokuto sounds like at the beginning Mino was even giving him a deeper voice than he kind of finally settled on, because their voices are very far apart in their duet line, at least in this song. Other than that, there's not a whole lot that's new in Breakthrough. It's kind of going back to that fairly typical pop rock style that Trickstar was doing for at least the first few years of the game. The very last part, you can hear him using that very natural, very nice vibrato, and by this point, Subaru's voice is basically where it's going to be for the rest of the series. I've always liked Diamond Summer. I think even amongst the other songs that kind of have the same vibe, it's probably one of my favorites. I don't know, there's something about this just very upbeat. It makes me feel happy when I'm listening to it, which is always a good thing. The chorus in this one is interesting because it's very hard to isolate duet parts because generally they're singing in duos, but they're just kind of overlapping lines, so I took what I could to get at least little duets out of it. But again, you can see how much more he is singing with Hokuto even in these couple of examples, and that does kind of track throughout the entire rest of the series. The one thing we haven't talked a lot about yet is Subaru's singing style in general, and because Trickstar does have a lot of these upbeat, more rock-based songs, at least within the percussion, he does tend to sing fairly on beat, which is interesting because if you look at the characters that Kaki typically voices, he seems to do a lot of characters like Subaru that are kind of Genki and upbeat, and then he has a lot of characters that kind of fit more into like a sultry, more mysterious vibe. And he does sing differently for those. Obviously, the latter would naturally have more of a feeling of singing behind the beat, whereas if you're playing energetic characters, you typically would sing to match that. And that's usually what he does as Subaru. He pulls it back sometimes in the ballads, but for the most part, Subaru is very on top of the beat and also has a very bright tone to his voice that suits the rather rhythmic style of his singing. Listening to this now, I'm realizing that at least in this song, a lot of the times they really go up into what would probably be called belting. It's when they're all in unison. And I guess I never thought of it that way because typically if there is a section like that, Subaru's voice is always so prominent in it just because he can handle that style of singing very well. So it kind of cuts off before that, but you can hear the run up to it. There's not a whole lot that's new in this one, and I feel like when this one came out, a lot of people didn't, I won't say that they didn't think much of it, but it just doesn't really bring anything new into Trickstar's discography. Even though personally I actually really like the song, it does kind of sound like a typical Western pop rock song, which is not a bad thing, but generally the songs in Ensemble Stars tend to trend longer, whereas the style, at least in Western pop music, lately has kind of been really short, like sub 3-minute songs. They've almost entirely gotten rid of bridges, which I personally don't like because a lot of times I feel like bridges in songs are some of the most musically interesting parts of them. So I actually like that for the most part, the songs in Idle Games, I have noticed that lately in OnStars they have started to get a little bit shorter, the latest Valkyrie one notwithstanding, but I'm glad they've kind of kept to the old formula because I find that so much more interesting than a lot of the pop music that's out there today. But regardless, I do like this song, but I also understand where people are coming from when they say it doesn't really bring anything new into Trickstar as a group.
はぐれた光の粒こだよきっと輝くよふとどこか遠くの空を Thank you for 何度も触れてきたね目の中でキラキラその気配が今日もかすむくらいのさ
Infinite Star is another one of those slower, more ballad type songs where he can really show off what his voice can do. Again, you hear really lovely vibrato. Most of the duet parts are unison, and again, something that I haven't talked a whole lot about but that I wish OnStars would do more is harmonies, because these voice actors can handle it. But so many times when they're having two of them sing together, they're always singing at the exact same pitch, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in the sense that most of their voices are different enough that you can still hear both of them. But harmony just is always more interesting to listen to. And this song for Subaru is nice because, again, he's using different parts of his tone. He's going lower in some parts, he's staying up higher in some parts. Obviously, I've talked a lot about Hokuto's voice and how it's changed. I've talked a little bit about Makoto's. I haven't really touched on Mao's at all, which, again, not his video, but I do like to at least talk about the other members of these groups in relation to the character that I'm speaking about. Mao's voice to me always reads incredibly warm, and I really like listening to him sing. Because I feel like there's this misconception that deep voices inherently have to be warm, and that's just not necessarily true. It is, however, true in his case, and Mao, as a character having a lot of, sun imagery associated with him, I think his voice suits that really well. And his voice and Subaru's are kind of at the perfect distance from each other, that they always sound really good when they're singing together.
輝かせていくんだ必死で走ってきた日々のことを明かしないあの空までのよりももっと眩しいしにしようがら重ねてく昨日と明日にそうと夢と
So this is the anime opening I was talking about putting in. There's two versions of it. There's a Trickstar version, there's an Eden version, so I'll probably use the Eden one in their video. It'll be kind of nice to compare it in that sense too. But at this point, he's basically opening up fully. He is varying his vibrato depending on the type of note that he's hitting. He's going into what I would basically consider a full belt at one point. And there is falsetto. And I had actually talked about this earlier and then cut it out of the audio when I was editing. But I couldn't actually remember if Subaru went into falsetto either as a solo or a duet in any of his songs, and he does as other characters, so I was going to put that in the beginning if he didn't, but he does. Interestingly, it is all in duets, so it's kind of hard to hear it isolated, but getting two characters to go falsetto at the same time is probably harder overall, so he does it a couple of times. This is the first one. He has a duet with Hoke where they go into falsetto at the same time. It is very clean from both of them, which is nice. There's a little bit of a slide into it that I'm inclined to believe is Hokuto, because hearing Kaki go into falsetto in other songs, he doesn't typically lead into it in any way. He just goes straight up to the note and hits it. But in any case, you hear an example of it here, and there's another one coming up in Big Bang Reflection that we'll talk about when we get there. He doesn't actually sing a whole lot in for sing-along, at least not in terms of solo parts. There is that one note that he hits that could definitely be a falsetto note if he wanted it to be. He goes up into it. It doesn't really sound like a belt, so that I would be inclined to believe is just another one of those moments where his chest voice and his head voices sound very similar, because it doesn't really have the effect that head voice normally would, but it's high enough that I would be inclined to believe that it should be there. Another thing that you've probably noticed listening through this, even if I haven't specifically talked about it, is that Subaru generally doesn't add anything else to his singing besides just singing the notes. He doesn't really do a whole lot of vocal cries or slides, or like I was talking about before, using anything to help him get into or out of falsetto or into or out of head voice. He just kind of hits notes, which sometimes can sound a little bit less dramatic just because there's nothing else outside of the note, but also it's very technically hard to do. So being able to hear how clean his singing is really nice, especially isolating it and getting to hear it all at once like this. So now we've gone into the 2 exclamation point era. This was the first event song in the game after music started. Makes sense that it would be Subaru's. And it does feature him quite a bit, but again, like a lot of the early unit event songs, the 5-star character doesn't get as much of the song as they probably should. So I'm interested to see what'll happen when he gets his next one, because he was at the very start of the first rotation, and now we're getting towards the end of the second rotation, at least for the 4-member unit. So I'm very interested to see what his next one will be. So this is the other one I was talking about, where he goes into a duet falsetto again, this time with Mao, and both of them hit it very clean. This also has very low singing, at least for Subaru, and you can hear it's kind of getting breathy again, which again leads me to believe that it's probably a choice for Kaki to not lower his larynx when he's singing, because again, he can hit those low notes very clean. You can hear it when he sings for other characters, but for Subaru, it's like he's intentionally trying to keep it high while singing low. So you kind of get this extra breathiness added to it that's not there otherwise. It doesn't really affect the warmness of his tone, but it gives it a little bit of a different feeling, and I kind of like hearing when he gets to sing those lower notes because it doesn't happen all that often. He doesn't get a whole lot in Find a Girl. Find a Girl is like really poppy, especially compared to their other songs. It's more electronic, at least in terms of the percussive backbeat that's happening. There's a little bit more of an effect on his vocals, and again, I've talked about before, I'm not against vocal effects when it fits the song, and I think it does fit this song. And it's not so intense that it completely changes how his voice sounds. He gets a couple of really nice high notes where, again, he's popping up into head voice incredibly clean. So you can probably tell that's a pattern at this point, but I'd say that's the biggest thing when listening to Subaru singing. Just listen to how easy it is for him to go between notes and between pitches and between ways that he's singing. It really sounds effortless, and it's really nice to listen to. So Unstoppable Love does this thing that they occasionally do in idle games. Mao's second solo kind of takes this path as well, and it also reminds me of things like Party Time Together and Thank You for Your Everything from Idolish 7, is where the backbeat is almost a punk backbeat, and in that I mean it is incredibly driving. The guitars and the drums and the bass are just hitting it really fast. And this seems to be a style that idle games go for sometimes, and I always find it a little bit strange because it always feels like the vocals are not set up to work with that kind of music. In this case, there's not quite as much of a disparity because the singing is quite fast and rhythmic, but there are certain places where it feels like they should be singing more notes than they are based on what the music is doing. But I think this overall is a good example of hearing how easy it is for Subaru to stay on beat and how he can handle these sections of really fast singing that we really haven't heard in a lot of the other Trickstar songs up until this point.
しの魂で迎え撃てと見開いた目ほとばしるこよが
Again, not a whole lot in Daydream Reality. He gets a little section with Makoto and a couple of really short solos, almost all, again, staying really down in his tone. And this is one of those songs, with the exception of the chorus, that does tend to stay fairly low, so again, you get to hear that lower part of his singing. So I'm glad they're letting him do that more, even if there's not a whole lot else to talk about with this particular song.
かと居場所くれて矢を育てて夢をくれるなんよプレッシャースタイル過ぎるステージよろしく手をつなごう全身で伝える僕ら星のように届く揺れるこの青春
And again, we get kind of the equivalent of a power ballad in terms of what Ensemble Stars does for this style of song. And I'm going to say the same things that I said about Nijiro no Seasons and Infinite Star in terms of how lovely his vocal control is. The vibrato, once again, is very pronounced. He goes up into a belt during the duet with Makoto and just opens up completely and then pulls it back a lot of times in the solos where there's less instrumentation happening. So this is one of those things where it's like, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's not a bad thing because it's so nice to listen to that I really don't care how many songs are like this. I will happily listen to all of them. So now we're getting into the more experimental songs in terms of what Trickstar is doing. Like this one, obviously it's a holiday song, it's a Christmas song, but it's hitting that like jazz swing style that normally would be something that Undead would do, for instance. The one thing about his voice that I haven't talked a whole lot about yet is that sometimes Kaki does this little enunciation thing where he'll almost kind of, his vowels sound mushy, and I don't know another way to describe it, but there are certain singers who do this. And it doesn't happen all the time, but I think a lot of times when he's sustaining especially longer vowels, you can kind of hear it. And it's more of a little singing quirk than anything, but because Subaru does it quite often, I thought I would mention it just to say that I did. Other than that, I think this style of song does suit Trickstar's vocals pretty well. Obviously, the majority of Trickstar's discography is, 4/4 basic rock beat. But when we get into songs like this, where you have this more of a swing beat, there are a couple of other times when you get into the bridges of songs where they'll do a little bit of offbeat singing. But this is probably the best example of it, and you can hear that he's perfectly fine staying on a singing beat that might not necessarily match the beat of the percussive background that's happening. So I'm glad that they're allowing these units to kind of expand further than the original musical niche that they were slotted into. Sometimes I feel like it's more effective than others. We'll get into that, but I think jazz and swing, Trickstar can handle pretty well. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about this one. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it in general. Again, I like the jazzy, swingy elements to it. The vocal work sounds good. The rapping part is kind of... For me, I feel like if you want to include rapping into a song, you just have to go for it. And usually they do, and this one they're kind of doing this like half singing, speaking style thing that's not really rapping. And I know I haven't gotten a chance to talk about the Ibarra Kato lecture song yet, but that'll be coming. And I'm not saying that every song that incorporates any type of rapping has to sound like that, because that was written by the person that does most of the Hypnosis Mic Division battle songs, but at the same time, the singing sounds very good. The MV's a lot of fun. There's just not a whole lot else to talk about in terms of this one. It is nice that he gets to sing with everyone from Fine in this. Wataru and Yuzuru very, very short snippets, but you can kind of hear that his voice does fit well with theirs. Tori's is a little bit longer, and then he sings a lot with Eiichi. And we talked about this a little bit in the Eiichi video, but they both have fairly nasalized tones that trend very warm. So when they sing together, it works really well. So I can understand why they get the bulk of the duets in this one. Subaru doesn't really have any solo parts in Crossing Heart, at least what parts that he's singing by himself, but it is kind of the first time we get to hear him singing with anyone that's not from Trickstar, so that part of it's nice.
Gotta give it all you got. You have a
There's not a whole lot in Replay either. He doesn't get to sing with Eve at all, but he gets to sing with both Nagisa and Ibara. Nagisa, they're actually singing octaves, which is interesting because, again, it's not, I mean, technically it's harmony, but it's harmony on the same note at different pitches. So there are some people that would say that's not true harmony, but at least it's something different. So I'm glad they did that. His voice and Ibara's, when they're singing together, they're actually quite close to each other, and they're singing at the same pitch when they do their part. And then he gets to sing with Hoke again. So like a lot of these cross-unit songs, half the time they end up singing with their own unit regardless. I think I mentioned this in the Yuta video. With this song, it's very, very hard to pick anything out because the parts are so short. He gets tiny, tiny duets with Mitsuru and Nazuna. I think he does get to say things with Yuta and Nikki as well, but that was mostly just kind of speaking lines in unison, so I didn't include that. And I also had mentioned in the Yuta video how Yuta's voice kind of brings down the energy of the group a little bit, and I would say second to his, Subaru's kind of has that effect as well, which might seem odd because, again, he has such an upbeat, bright tone to his voice. But because of how inherently warm it is, it kind of tempers some of the higher, sharper voices like Mitsuru and Nazuna that are inevitably going to sound more energetic just because of that. So I feel like this song, even though it is super upbeat and fast, there's enough of a blend of voices that it doesn't become overwhelmingly hyperactive. Rina's voice, again, is very deep, so just like kind of with Hokuto and Mao, Subaru is going to sound good with him because there's enough of a difference that you can really hear both of them in the mix. And this is one where I wish he would have gotten to do a little bit more of the solo rapping because just the general vibe of it lends itself to hitting a little bit harder than What You Gonna Do does, which doesn't happen, but you can still hear again how easy it is for him to stay on beat when you have this really driving percussive background and he's staying completely on top of the notes. And that covers everything except for the solos, so let's take a look at those ones next. I like both of Subaru's solos, probably about equally. There's not a whole lot, again, between them lyrically, I would say, but they're both, I feel like they both suit him very well. And My Starry Point basically shows off everything that we've talked about so far. His vocal control, his vibrato, his belting. This is the one time he actually does slide into a note with a vocal cry. And like I've said before, sometimes that does have the effect of adding emotion to singing, and I feel like that's what it's being used for here, because evidently at this point he doesn't need to use it as a technical aid in any way, but I think it's just, when you have a song like this that is a complete solo, sometimes you just want to add a little bit more into it. So I think that's mostly what it's for, but it does sound really nice. And like I mentioned before, he doesn't actually do falsetto in either of these solos, but he does go into a belt at the end as well. So it's kind of showing off, I would say, everything in his voice except for the falsetto, which I think we've heard enough examples of regardless to know that he could do it if he needs to. Okay, admittedly, there is one note in there that is probably, you could probably argue whether it's head voice or falsetto. It's very close in either case, but once again, a song I think that showcases his voice really well. When I was listening to this, the part at the end where he hits those really rapid staccatos, He sounds almost exactly like Leo. And that's kind of the first time it's happened. I've mentioned before that there are some other characters who, when they sing, kind of sound like other characters occasionally. Subaru pretty much always sounds like himself, but I don't know. It's very Leo-esque to me, just his tone and how sharply he's cutting off the notes, which just isn't something that's happened in a lot of his other songs, so that might be part of it, but interesting nonetheless. Regardless, I do really like both of Subaru's solos. I like listening to them. I think they're great vocal showcases, which, as I've said before, that's mostly what I'm looking for in a solo. So I think both of these accomplish that very well. And that brings us to the end. I probably talked more than I had intended to. I feel like I repeated myself a lot, but that's, again, when you have someone that is as technically proficient as Kaki is, sometimes there's not a whole lot to talk about in terms of progression, which is kind of what I figured at the beginning of this video. But I hope it was still interesting, even if it's just to listen to Subaru's singing in isolation as opposed to in whole songs. It was still really fun to do. Again, I'll never complain about listening to him singing, so I'm glad I got to do this one. So as for what's coming next, I believe I had said before that I was going to do Shu. I am going to do Shu. That plan hasn't changed. We're doing Shu next. We're doing Valkyrie finally. After that, I will finish up the rest of the 4-person units. I haven't quite decided who I'm going to do first. Maybe Himeru, because I've had a few people ask about that, and Crazy Bee has some very interesting songs that I'd like to take a closer look at. I said I would do Nazuna for Rabbit, so I will do that. Eden, I haven't quite settled on who I want to do yet. I know that both Hiyori and June have songs coming up pretty soon with that whole subunit project thing that's happening. But by the time I get to Eden, those will probably have happened already, so I am open to suggestions in terms of Eden, who you want me to take a look at first. So that's the plan going into the next few videos. As always, I hope you enjoyed this and that you found it interesting. Please do like, comment, do all the things that the algorithm wants you to do, and I will see you next time.